On my hand here is the Sony Alpha 1, and today I'll talk about 3 things I like about this camera, which I think is better than most cameras out there, and 3 things I felt that could be improved, especially when comparing to the nearest competitor, the Canon R5. I'm Richard and welcome to ZP Productions. This is the Sony Alpha 1. I'm a portrait photographer and I'll be actually basing on what I feel the 3 things that are great about this camera and the 3 things not so great based on my experience as a portrait photographer over a few photo shoots. Now, I'm a person who likes to bring the camera out into the field to test it out and give you really real-world experience on why this thing is great or not. So if you don't agree with me, that's okay because everybody may shoot slightly differently. And not only that, you may not be a portrait photographer. You may be a photographer that shoots something else. And you may be a photographer that shoots actions and sports. And this camera will be distinctly different for you, especially if you're shooting sports itself. So let's talk about the Alpha 1 on what are the 3 things I felt was great as a portrait photographer and 3 things that I felt not so great coming from the same point of view. Now, firstly, what's so great about this camera? Firstly, I'll say as the latency of this camera is really, really low. It means that what I see on the viewfinder is very close to what is happening in real life, and when I press the shutter, what I will capture is very close to what I last seen on the viewfinder itself. And why does that actually matter? Now, if you think about it, if you are flipping a model's dress, unless you are looking to burst a shot, or if you are using flash, you can't even burst at all. This low latency allows you to catch the dress frozen in mid-air without having the need to burst the shot itself. And that is important because sometimes you really don't have a choice to burst. Now, this whole latency thing, I actually have a whole video that talk about it here. Take a look at it because this camera truly has lower latency than the R5, especially if you boost the viewfinder to its maximum 240 FPS. You really get a very good experience of near live viewing in the EVF itself and very low latency from viewing to shutter. Very great. Now, continuing on from just now, the second thing that I like about this camera is the ability to sync the flash at really high speed. This camera does sync at 1400 without losing any power, and beyond that, you have to enter high-speed sync itself. Now, why is that important? It depends on what kind of photographer are you. If you have shot any form of flash photography, higher speed sync, that gives you the ability to cue ambient light. And how does it matter? If you are a studio photographer, it means that you can on your ambient light 1 stop higher without affecting your photo's quality. Because ambient light do seep in your photo, but if you have 1 stop more headroom, you can lift it higher and it helps you in terms of autofocus. It helps you in terms of visibility on the model. It does help you in many other ways. So really, the ability to shoot 1 stop higher in terms of shutter speed is a great thing on the Alpha 1. Now, that is for studio. If you're going outdoor, it's even better because you can kill the sunlight 1 more stop, which means that rather than shooting at f8, which you have to shoot at f8 if you want to shoot outdoor with a 1/200 shutter, you can now shoot at f5.6 and still sync your flash at 1/400 with an equivalent exposure using less flash power, or you can actually use the flash and overpower the sun because now you can actually have 1 stop lower in terms of ambient exposure itself. And it also helps you in high-speed sync because if you are shooting high-speed sync, what happens is that you lose power later. As such, you overall get 1 more stop power out of your flash. Now, not everybody have a 1200 watt flash. Some people only have a 300 watt or 200 watt or even 100 watt flash. The Alpha 1 does make a difference. Then again, you'll be wondering why are you using Alpha 1 and not using a 1200 watt flash? Because you don't want to carry that 1200 watt flash. That thing is heavy. Pretty much that answers the question. Okay, now the next thing is what I felt so great about this camera is its silent shutter capability or its electronic shutter capability. Firstly, the Alpha 1 electronic shutter do not actually degrade the photo quality significantly in any way. Based on my own test, it degrades maybe like 0.2 or 0.3 stops. It just has slightly more noise, especially at higher ISO. But other than that, it really doesn't degrade the quality much. Unlike the R5, it does degrade about a stop of dynamic range, so that is a huge deal. As such, you can potentially shoot electronic shutter on the Alpha 1. And how does it help you? Firstly, it gives you lower latency. Secondly, it is more responsive. And thirdly, it gives you higher shutter speed that you can ever get out of a normal camera like the R5. And lastly, your model won't actually fidget because they can't hear the shutter itself. So when I was using the silent shutter with this camera, I did notice that the models don't fidget as much because they can't hear the shutter sound. They can't tell you have taken a photo. As such, they pose a little bit longer and a little bit more stable. When I was using normal mechanical shutter, they tend to fidget around a little bit more. Now, you can only do this on the Alpha 1 because other cameras, as I said, you lose significant amount of dynamic range or quality. Or this camera, there's no loss. As such, I will shoot electronic shutter fully on this camera itself. And as I said earlier, this camera also can go beyond most cameras' shutter speed. 1/8,000 on this camera, but this camera can go 110,000, 112,000, 116,000 for this camera itself. How does it affect you? It's because if you are shooting, let's say, a full body shot with a f1.4 lens to separate the background from your subject, this camera can do it, while other cameras may overexpose because the shot for daylight based on experience is about 112,000 to 110,000 to get a proper exposure. But most cameras do not go that far for shutter speed unless the electronic shutter works. And only on this camera, the electronic shutter really doesn't affect your image quality in any significant way. As such, I recommend you to use it that way for this camera itself. Now that's about it. What are the three things that I like about this camera? Once again, low latency, high flash sync speed, and then the ability to shoot in silent shutter without losing any quality, allowing you to do many other things, that are restricted if you can only shoot in mechanical shutter for most other camera brands. Now let's talk about what are the three things that I felt could be improved. And firstly, right off the bat, I'll tell you IBIS. The IBIS on this camera, or on Sony cameras in general, isn't as great as the Canon cameras. The Canon cameras just felt more stable. I'm not talking about super low shutter speed, I'm talking about 130, 140. And if I was using a 135mm lens, I felt that I could get a lot more shots with my Canon than my Sony itself, and that helps me a lot for night photography itself. So if I'm doing a night portraiture with available light, I find my Canon is more reliable than my Sony because you can actually shoot at 130 and 140 and get constantly sharp shots. While for the Sony itself, I felt that if I'm using an 85 or 135mm lens, I get slightly soft. It's just a personal experience. I think it's not a big deal to most people, but if you are the type who would like to do available light photography or using LED lights to do photography or do photography at night, you'll be affected by this. And the next two things will be on autofocus. Firstly, I want to talk about is the autofocus box. The autofocus box on the Sony camera is a little bit big. Now, I can show you a side-by-side video. You will notice that the Canon autofocus box is slightly smaller than the Sony's one. And how does it affect you? If you are doing half-body shot, shooting at a f2.8 with a 100mm lens or 150mm lens or 135mm lens, what will happen is that your iris may be slightly softer than your lashes because the autofocus box is just too huge on the Sony. It tends to focus on the iris, on the eyebrows or something like that. While for the Canon, the autofocus box seems to be smaller and Canon seems to be prioritizing the center of the autofocus box. As such, if you move it over the iris have a higher tendency to be sharper than everything else. Now, you may be saying that why not just increase your depth of field, right? But even if you increase the depth of field to f4, f5.6, with a high-resolution camera like this, when you do zoom in, you can actually see a difference. Now, if you are looking at it from a full picture point of view, it probably doesn't matter as much. I honestly have to say that. If you zoom out and fit the image to your screen, you probably can't tell. As a photographer, when you are touching up the photo at 100% or 200%, you can tell, and it is a little bit irritating when the lashes are sharper than the iris itself. And if you go closer, like 1/3 of a body, and you want to shoot f2, because some people like to do that kind of really shallow depth of field where the eyes are in focus and everything just blurs off. Well, on the Sony camera, it's a little bit harder because the AF box is now bigger. You have a higher tendency to get the lashes sharp rather than the iris sharp. On the Canon camera, it is slightly easier. Now, this is of course based on the fact that face detection is not working, eye detection is not working. When eye detection is working for both cameras, you won't have this problem at all, but not every day the eye detection works perfectly. In fact, if the hair is covering half the face, or for whatever reason, the hairdo is very weird, or the guy is wearing a hat, or he's wearing glasses, or he combed the hair in certain ways, eye detection can fail, and as such, you have to move the autofocus box manually. I would say as the Canon do a better job because it has a smaller autofocus box. And the last thing that I felt was the biggest deal about the Alpha 1, I didn't notice it in a Canon, I tried a few times in fact, is that the Alpha 1, when shot at f8, the autofocus tends to hunt. Let me show you this video here. You notice that the autofocus will jitter, and then suddenly it loses autofocus altogether. Now, this is of course in continuous autofocus. If you do single shot, you won't have as much problem, but there is a tendency sometimes that it can be a little bit soft. I would say as a little bit. Still means it's very sharp, just not like ultra tech sharp. That's the feeling I get. So it does mean that shooting f8 with the Alpha 1 have a low chance that it just jitters and then shifts out of focus if you are doing the normal Sony way of using autofocus, which is continuous AF. Now you may be wondering, other brands may do the same thing, but no, the R5 doesn't do that at all. Let me show you the R5 video. You will see that the focus is solid. You can hear the lens trying to compensate because the camera is still rocking forward and backward, but you will see that it will never lose focus and there will be never loss of focus suddenly, which the Alpha 1 actually does. So this is a big deal. If you are a studio photographer, you are the type that shoot at f8, f11, f16, this may affect you because suddenly the autofocus is not as reliable as it should be at times. In fact, I was doing a few of these crown shoots that I did recently with my friend Chloe. It really does affect me quite a bit. When I was trying to focus on her, it just suddenly decides to shift out of focus for no good reason. And that's my biggest pain point really in the last few weeks. And that's about it for today. Really, the Alpha 1 is a fantastic piece of camera. And as I said, today's experience is purely based on shooting portraiture. Now, the Alpha 1 is really not the extreme best camera to do portraiture. If you ask me, the A7R4 may be a slightly better choice. And if you don't need the megapixels, the A7 III will probably do the job too. But you cannot deny the fact that 50 megapixel with state-of-the-art equipment and state-of-the-art autofocusing and state-of-the-art everything else, latency, the Alpha 1 is truly the best camera there is out there. But that being said, after using for 3 to 4 weeks now, I think that the R5 probably can do everything I want. And as a portrait photographer's camera, the pros of the Alpha 1 sometimes are important, but the smaller autofocus box on the R5 is very important to me because there are times that you just cannot autofocus or IAF or whatever reason, and the small little autofocus box do help you a lot in pinpointing your focus a lot better than the Alpha 1. So, in conclusion, I would say as the Alpha 1 is the best camera, but for shooting portrait itself, the R5 can be a better choice depending on what you're shooting and how you're shooting. That's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this short little video. Do like and subscribe if you want to see more of such video. If not, I'll see you again in my next equipment or tutorial or whatever video I made. Till then, bye-bye.